So good morning, everyone, and welcome very much to this short webinar entitled Effective Team Communication. And thanks for giving up your time to invest in your skills. Over the next 30-40 minutes or so, I want to explore some of the key issues in effective team communication and share with you a number of tools, tips, and challenges that you can put to good use, I hope, immediately. As usual, we're going to pack a lot in, so you may want something handy to capture notes and actions that you plan to take. I've included a download link to the slide deck in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow, so you can get copies of the slides. As we move through the webinar, I'll be looking for your involvement, your feedback, asking you questions that you can answer via the chat function. And as always, when you answer, would you please check that you are sending your response in a way that everyone can see it rather than just Bob and I as panelists. So this morning, what I want to do is explore 4 key communication questions. And as you reflect on those questions, your answers hopefully will tell you quite a lot about your current communication approach. So those questions are: how versatile is your communication? How are you communicating with your teams currently? What is the effect on team performance? And how well are you listening? Now, it's not intended to be a deep dive, more of a broader look at many of the key factors. So let's start with a challenge. I'd like you to put a few words or short phrases into chat in a minute that completes the following. Communication is like ... because ... So for example, I might say communication is like oxygen because it's all around us and we take it for granted. Now, you might need 30 seconds or so to think about this, but then enter your words or your phrases into the chat box. Just put like, whatever the word or phrase is, and because, whatever the word or phrase is. In the meantime, then let me share with you my favorite quote. I use it a lot, and for me, it sums up the communication challenge. It's from George Bernard Shaw, and it's the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taking place. And most of us think that we're communicating clearly and effectively, but is that an illusion? That's the challenge. So let's have a look and see how you have responded to our communication challenge. I'm going to have to put my glasses on to have a look at this, see what sort of things we have. Communication is like throwing a pebble into a lake. Oh, wonderful, because the ripples go far and wide. Yeah, I like that. Communication, oh, excuse me, I've touched my mouth. Communication is like blood because it carries really important things around the organization. Oh, wow. I like that as well. Do you know, I've used this exercise a lot over the years, and I really wish I'd captured all the great things that people say, because I could have written a book about it by now. But it's a good thing to demonstrate. So why is effective communication so challenging? Well, as people say in their social media relationship status, it's complicated. Oh, I've lost the ability to change slides now. Shouldn't move to chat all at the same time. So we have a tendency to take all our information in through our senses and then bombarded by masses of information constantly. And it requires far too much energy for our brains to process this information flow. The brain has to manage it. And as a result, we're actually only consciously aware of about 2% of what's happening at any given moment. But the information is still being taken in and processed. You know, have you ever been driving and suddenly you've realized you can't remember driving the last 10 minutes? You've been through traffic lights, you've been around roundabouts, and you suddenly panic that you might have killed someone. But of course, in reality, whilst you've been thinking about the meeting you're going to or listening to the radio, your subconscious stopped you at the red light, took you the right way around the roundabout. So we fundamentally are really working a bit like computers. In reality, actually, it's the other way around. Computers really work like people. Typically, 2% of a computer's memory capacity is RAM, random access memory, the stuff the computer is actively working on in the moment. The rest is hard drive for storage and retrieval. Now, computers tend to have a base operating system, MS Windows, for example, and on top of that operating system sits a wide variety of different applications. And people are like that. Our RAM is our conscious awareness, our conscious activity. Our hard drive is our unconscious storage and retrieval. Our base operating system is deep-rooted human responses such as fight and flight. And our software, well, that's different ways of processing information and paying attention to different stuff. A great example of some of the different software that was demonstrated by Walter 2 or 3 weeks ago when he spoke about empathy profiling. Now, I happen to use a profiling model called social styles, and that's also a great framework for thinking and helping people understand their software and the software of others. And part of our base operating system means that as the information is being processed, it passes through a number of filters. And 3 of those core filters are deletion. In order to manage all this information and manage space, our brain actually will ignore and remove things that we've told it don't matter. Distortion, well, it's a bit like that Chinese whispers, as we used to call it, game. It alters the facts, it alters our interpretation to suit our views and our needs. And finally, generalization, it clusters large amounts of information together and files them under a single meaning. So yeah, it's complicated. So the secret of really effective communication: communicate in the software of others, not your personal preference. Meet people where they are. In other words, the secret is versatility. Now, in the days when we could have a foreign holiday in France, for example, how often have you heard a Brit speaking English, but in a French accent? And then when they're not understood, continuing to speak English, but speaking more slowly and loudly and looking very confused when it doesn't work. They're effectively speaking in their software, and when it doesn't work, what they tend to do is use the same strategy harder, which of course still doesn't work. So being versatile, able to communicate in the software of others is vital. One major base operating system challenge that we all need to be aware of: it's inconceivable to the human brain that things don't make sense. In the absence of information, people make it up in order to make it make sense. However, by the time it's passed through our filters and been stored, we forget it's made up, and when we recall it, we treat it as if it's a fact. Now, I think of this as the information gap. It simply gets filled in, and it poses some major communication challenges that we need to be aware of and overcome. So what does this mean in day-to-day communication and how you communicate with your teams? Now, to my view, there are 3 prime leadership communication focus points. There's the task, and that will involve a whole load of stuff around target setting, planning, organizing, quality control, resource allocation, project progress reviews, KPIs, sales data. I mean, the list is endless. There's then team focus, where we're communicating around relationships, role clarity, morale and motivation, collaboration, group feedback on issues that relate to the whole group. And then finally, individuals, personal motivation, personal development, personal feedback. So I have a question for you, and I'm going to ask you to estimate how much of your communication effort do you think is currently focused on each of those 3 elements? And remember the filters. Don't accept the first thought that comes into your mind. Challenge yourself to guess the reality. So in the chat box, I'm looking for 3 figures: task, a percentage figure; team, a percentage figure; and then individual focus and a percentage figure. So if you haven't already done so, put your response in the chat box now. That would be great. Okay, here we go. Task 10%, team 40, individual 10. Task 50, team 10, individual 40. Task 13. Ah, okay, so we've got an even split on some. Team 70, oh, that's good, that's high. 20, 20, 60. Okay, so we've got quite a range, which is good. Interestingly, it's not reflecting quite what I've found in my experience, because in my experience, an awful lot of communication is focused on task, less on team, but a bigger chunk, and then very little on the individual. I would say, in my experience, a more typical example is probably 60 tasks, 30 to 40, or 30, I guess, on a team and maybe 10 on individual. So there's a warning. Of course, it's not just really about the time spent, it's also about the quality and the content. So a one-to-one feedback session can focus solely on task and be effective, or a one-way diatribe and give little opportunity for the individual to contribute, let alone talk about themselves. So here's a simple challenge that you can try after the webinar. It will help you recognize the benefit of bringing an issue into RAM, your random conscious awareness, if you like, and really focus on it. For one day, or even half a day if you have to, pay conscious attention to and keep a log of all your prime communication activity, and then decide if its prime focus was really task information, team relationship information, or individual. And then another time, focus conscious attention on one communication event and review the quality of the communication. And I think you'll be surprised with what that might show you. So let's work some ideas and tips through to help you challenge your thinking on how you communicate and enable you to provide target areas for improvement. So what are your current communication challenges? In a moment, I'm going to launch a poll giving you some suggestions. It's not intended as an exhaustive list, so please select any of the channels you use for communicating with your teams currently, and you can select more than one. If you select other, then please also put into the chat what other channels you use. So I'm hopefully going to not change the slide. Launch the poll. Why won't it let me launch the poll? Eventually it's letting me launch the poll. Cool. Okay, so hopefully we've launched the poll now. Forgive me if I put my glasses on, or else I won't be able to see the results.
Yeah, the poll is there.
Great. So I'm interested in which of those channels you use. So if you could put your indications in, that would be great. Here they come. People are obviously having to think about it, which is good.
I'm busy trying to enter information. Of course, as a public, I can't vote.
No, sorry, I blocked you from voting, Bob. Sorry. Nothing personal, you understand. Okay, good. Well done. We're getting. Oh, okay.
What are you seeing? Because I can't see.
What I'm seeing at the moment is a lot of moving figures. So currently, actually, we're up to 78% voted now. So I'll give it another couple of seconds. But we've got some interesting and very wide responses. Okay, so I'm going to give it another few seconds. We're up to 84% of people voted, and then I will end the poll and share the results. Okay, here we go. End the poll. Hopefully you should see the results in a moment.
Yay, I can see them.
So, interesting. So we've got a joint tie for email and telephone video calls, and then followed pretty closely by team meetings, whether that's real or virtual. Unfortunately, I'm limited by the number of choices I can select, because I would have liked to have separated real or virtual. And then we've also got only 4% in another channel. So if you're one of the people that has put something in other, then by all means, please put something into the chat. So let me take away those results for now.
No extra comments in the chat yet. I'll keep an eye on it.
No, okay, thank you. I think I've managed to move ahead on my slides somehow, which I need to get back onto sync with. Okay, so.
We've had Zoom, Skype, Office Communicator as extra channels.
Cool. Okay. So which is a question for you, and also you can put this into the chat, would be quite good. Which, if any, of the channels are new to you since lockdown started? So if you've got channels that have only really been starting using since lockdown, then please feel free to put something into the chat now. That would be great. I'm guessing
Teams, WhatsApp, team groups.
Yeah. So Zoom. I'm guessing at the moment it's around a lot of the virtual presentation stuff, which is good.
Teams, groups, GoToMeeting, Team, yeah. Google Meet. I've not used that yet. Online presentation.
New, I think. Google Meet.
Hmm.
For goodness sake.
Slack.
Yes, I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so examples that I've used of people doing things are like using virtual water cooler sessions, you know, so where people are working remotely, they've gathered people together, often using Zoom, things like that. People who have been making regular, frequent personal calls, maybe senior managers have been calling people directly via telephone or possibly again by video chat. I've heard quite a lot of people encouraging their teams to do day in the life videos and then sharing those around, because of course they've got people working in offices, people who are furloughed, people who are working from home, and even companies who've started running competitions. So consider broadening your communication channels. It may be that the recent lockdown has encouraged you, or as we've demonstrated, possibly forced your hand to start using this process. But ask yourself the appropriate key channels that you use. Are they appropriate for your teams? You know, don't treat people as you like to be treated. Treat others as they like to be treated. For example, if you've got a lot of millennials in your team, or even just a single team, stereotypically maybe software developers, but they're very likely to have different preferences for the communication channels that you use. And whatever channels you're using, especially written channels, remember to consider what tone is likely to be coming across. You might think it's light and cheerful, and then you'll be shocked when you get a negative backlash. Always, always pause, reread, reevaluate the tone of a message before you send it or you publish it, you press send. Now, authenticity. Your messages need to be authentic. You know this. It needs to be what you really believe, not what you think your teams want or what you think they need to hear necessarily. If your team perceives you don't believe what you're saying, it will rarely have a neutral impact. It's far more likely to have a very negative impact. Your people are likely to feel misled, manipulated, ignored, but of course, mostly they won't tell you that. It will just impact performance. Typically, we judge ourselves by our intentions. We judge others by their behavior, by what they do and say. Your intent always needs to be clear. And remember, in the absence of information, people make it up. Not maliciously, mostly. They simply have to make sense of it. So if you don't state your intention, you leave a gap, it will be filled. And the sad reality is that people almost always create a negative, almost like my slide, a doomsday scenario. I'm not sure why that is, they just do it. It's probably a deep-seated defense mechanism. But this is how the rumor mill works. Information gaps are plugged by misinformation, and because these tend to have a negative slant, they seem to spread more quickly and more effectively than any positive message might. So ideally, for all communication, everything needs to be in line with your stated values, with your vision, your mission, your goals, your objectives, targets, and your behaviors. Now, here's a couple of high-profile recent communication examples to compare with. So let's start with Captain, no, sorry, Colonel, no, wait a minute, Sir Tom Moore. There's a man who was communicating to a whole group of people with a very clear intent, very clear purpose, clear goals, no personal ego. It was all about mission, focused on others rather than himself. Compared to this man, Dominic Cummings, now ignoring the politics and even ignoring the rights and wrongs of the situation. Lots of information gaps, mixed messages, a mismatch of behavior and stated goals, values. The list goes on. Both messages spread like wildfire, but with very different outcomes. One was very authentic, positive intent, all in line, and the other had lots of gaps, mismatches, mixed messages, and fundamentally was received as, do as I say, not as I do. And as leaders, you set the tone. You're the role model of both communications and behavior. And behaviors really matter. People take far more notice of what you do. You have to walk the talk. Your messages need to be clear. It's very easy to get caught up in management speak or just overcomplicate the message. Now, here's a simple example from the Plain English campaign. High quality learning environments are a necessary precondition for facilitation and enhancement of ongoing learning processes. After the Plain English campaign had worked on it, staff need good training if they are to learn properly. We have to be crystal clear with our messages. We need to be concise. Less is always, always more. We need to be focused, get to the point, and stay there. And stay relevant, stay on topic. Don't overburden your people with lots of extra information. And it needs to be complete. Surgeons, for example, use briefing protocols. They use checklists to make sure they haven't missed anything, because the information, of course, is often life or death to them. And finally, it needs to be prompt, quick responses and answers. Without that, information gaps will be filled. And words matter. Your words are a vital part of your message, whether they're spoken, written, virtual, real world. But we rarely choose our words consciously, especially in conversation. Even with written conversation, we don't take time to review our words. We're all very busy people after all. But unfortunately, our words give a lot away about our thinking or lead others to interpret our intentions wrongly. Now, many of us have been brought up to think that you can look up the meaning of a word in a dictionary, and I'm afraid it's not true. At best, you can look up a more widely held interpretation, but the same word can evoke many different interpretations from people at different times. So an example shared with me recently was the MD of a business who was messaging his people to give them what he believed was positive news about returning to work. He got quite a negative reaction from some of his people because quite a few were working from home, and so quickly picked up that what they saw as a suggestion that they'd not really been working. Others had been furloughed and felt bad about the fact they had not been working, whilst colleagues had been working. And then finally, some had worked relatively normally throughout and so didn't see it as a change. And the MD realised that returning to the office might have been a better phrase than returning to work. Now, you can argue that you'll never get it right, and I agree. Yet taking time to pull things up into RAM and consciously risk check key phrases can save you a lot of time and effort trying to recover from a gaffe. At the other end of the scale, also be aware that someone who's clearly choosing their words very carefully is often regarded with suspicion, as it's assumed what they're trying to do is cover up. So that's why authenticity is so important. Make sure you consider any implications for words and phrases that have particular cultural or diversity implications as well. Ask questions, real questions. Over the years, I've often been asked if I could just give one skill to leaders and managers, what would it be? And my answer tends to surprise people because it is the skill of asking questions. When you listen to leaders and managers in action, we're not really very good at asking genuine questions. We are far, far stronger at making statements and offering solutions. In his 7 Habits book, Stephen Covey stressed the importance of seeking first to understand. Now, if I was being cynical, me, I hear you say, then I would say that managers have got better at trying to disguise their instructions and solutions as questions. It's a sort of more sophisticated tell. Good questions involve people, providing your intention is to genuinely understand. So here's another post-webinar challenge. Pay conscious attention to a conversation one of your leaders or managers is having with a team. Ideally, you're not directly part of that conversation. And just notice the frequency of good quality questions, seeking to understand, versus the frequency of statements, telling. And also notice the amount of pre-question judgment, assumptive gap filling, to use the jargon, in those statements. I predict it will be a real eye-opener. Now, if you want to hone your questioning skills, there's an offer at the end of the webinar to access my best-selling course, Ask Better Questions, Build Better Relationships, for a stupidly low price for 3 days. And in fact, as an incentive to keep people to the end, for one person at the end, I will give free access to that course. Now, never forget, communication is a two-way process, and it is easy to forget that. Now, questioning is one good way to encourage involvement and participation, but also take every opportunity to give and receive high quality feedback. Feedback that's clear, specific, and descriptive. Now, high quality feedback, in my view, is all about the self-perceived risk for the person giving the feedback. And in general, the higher the risk, the higher the likely value. Leaders and managers have got a tendency to reduce that risk by being broader, non-specific, and hinting, hoping that the team or the individual gets the message. And it means they've got a lot more room to maneuver if it goes wrong. So in reality, it is creating an information gap that will be filled and interpreted by the receiver, and rarely will they interpret it as you really intended. So make sure you give or seek individual feedback for issues that relate to an individual or possibly a subgroup, but give whole team feedback for issues that relate to the whole team and that each member of the team can actually do something about. Notice how often managers hide behind group feedback when they should really be giving individual feedback. They pretend to themselves that the individual will know it means them and respond accordingly, but in reality, they almost certainly won't. But again, the manager has reduced the risk, because if someone's not happy, then they can say, no, I didn't mean you, and avoid tackling an issue. Now, I'm not a big fan of the labeling of positive and negative feedback. In my view, feedback is simply that. It's feedback. You know, this happened, this was the consequence, this is what I think it means. Always position feedback as your opinion, because that's all it is. But catch people doing things right, brilliant, give them high quality feedback. Catch people doing things not so well, great, give them high quality feedback. So two-way communication is important. And remember, talk with people, not about people. And take ownership for mistakes. We all make them. It's part of being human. Taking genuine ownership for mistakes just further demonstrates authenticity and, in my view, integrity. So never be afraid to apologize, to focus attention on correcting the mistake, of course, if at all possible. And at the risk of referring back to the great Mr. Cummings, trying to brazen it out, following a strategy of confuse and distract, failing to apologize will put immense strain on team relationships. And at best, you will end up with a team that are compliant. Far more likely, you'll have a team seeking to undermine you at every available opportunity. And most of the time, the truth will out at some point. So it's far better to deal with it at the time. If at all possible, get together regularly and informally. Do fun stuff. Get to know people as individuals. Provide opportunities for people to interact with each other in a more relaxed, less formal environment. It doesn't mean you've all got to go on holiday together or you need weekly sessions at the pub, but look for ways to encourage interaction. Quizzes, challenges, fundraising. Ask your teams for ideas and suggestions for what they would like to do. So here's a question. What sort of activities do you find in work in your team or your business currently for providing that informal, more social interaction? Put something in the chat box now. That would be great. I'll put my glasses on so I can read it, so forgive me for a second. Charity walks. Oh, I like that. That's a really nice idea. Yeah, lunch breaks out of the office. Yeah, quizzes. Yeah, I think those have grown. Non-school uniform days, I like. Yeah, company barbecues, cool. 60-second garden games. Oh, that's nice. Make a tea or coffee and then ensure I don't just stop for a chat. Monthly staff barbecues. Cool. Okay, so you're certainly on the case there, people, which is great. So build the right toolkit as well. Make sure that your teams have got the right tools and the resources to complete the task. Now, a lot of businesses have made extraordinary efforts to make sure that people have been equipped to work remotely in the recent lockdown example. But my challenge, would the same thing have been achieved in the same time frame under normal circumstances? Probably not. Update team documentation consistently so everyone's able to stay up to date with developments, and technology has certainly helped enormously with this, and many team collaboration tools have been created. You know, I hear a lot about businesses using Slack, Monday.com, and of course Microsoft Teams, and I know one or two of you have already referred to ones that you do. So here's a question in the chat. What do you use currently to encourage collaboration and information sharing in your teams? If you can just highlight in chat, that would be great. What I will do in a minute as well is share with you, if I can, a link to an article around collaboration. So we've got Asana, oh, I don't know yet. All hands sessions, yeah. Weekly calls, yeah. A Basecamp, I like that. WhatsApp, Zoom, Team, and Smartsheet, yeah. So some are using technology, some of you are still using meetings, which is great. So let me just put the link, while I can do that, into the chat, which is just a link to an article that talks about a number of sort of up-to-date, more software-related issues. So what makes communication effective and important for business leaders? Of course, it's impact. And effective team communication means higher levels of engagement, which then means increased productivity. And employee engagement is a really hot topic and has been for many years. Many businesses regularly survey their teams to benchmark levels of engagement. And a good quality of survey data exists. But how are we doing? Let's explore some data from Gallup. And they're one of the key leaders in this field. But before we do that, a quick question, and again, put something in chat. How much in dollars, because it's an American survey, but how much in dollars do you think it's estimated that Fortune 500 companies lose each year by people not sharing knowledge and not collaborating? So just in dollars, put a figure. How much do you think in a year companies are losing in Fortune 500 in America? 34 billion? Yeah, wow, that's a big number. Billions? Yeah. Well, you're obviously all on the case with this, which is great. And the research suggests it's estimated 31.5 billion. And that's a lot at stake. So what's a typical level of engagement for companies? Well, the trend has been increasing slowly in recent years. And if you attended Kate's session a couple of weeks ago, you may remember she referred to an engagement level of 13%. And that's for people who are highly engaged. The figures here are for those who are engaged generally and includes highly engaged. So the graph is showing a slowly rising trend and currently up at, well, more recent data, up to about 34%. And notice that 13% are actively disengaged. In other words, they're working against you. And the remaining 53% are in the not engaged category. They may be generally satisfied, but actually they're not cognitively and emotionally connected to the workplace. They will usually show up to work, do the minimum required, but then leave for the company for a slightly better offer. And interestingly, I've heard quite a lot of anecdotal evidence from businesses that actually measure their engagement, that it's gone up during lockdown. So quick question to put into chat. Why do you think that is? Why might engagement have gone up in the lockdown period? Glasses off to read the chat. Fear. Well, that's certainly a possibility. Fear of losing their job, I guess you could argue, but fear is rarely an engaging strategy, I would suggest. Loneliness is another idea. Yeah, novelty of new ways of communicating. People like to collaborate. Leaders are working harder as people are working remotely. Absolutely. I definitely think that there's been much more focus on communicating with people at all of those levels, the task level, certainly in terms of keeping people together as teams because they're working in remote locations. And also, a lot of companies have been having lots of one-to-one calls because they're worried about people. So there's been much more authenticity and far more genuine concern possibly around what's happening. So the good news is that there's a lot to play for, and a few exceptional organizations actually achieve over 70% of their workers with high engagement levels, and they're ready to outperform the competition. So a couple of leading examples are shown here that are often cited. Southwest Airlines, one of their key focus points is getting employees to think and act like owners. The Hyatt Hotel Group, then that's a sector with traditionally very high turnover, and they have a real strong communication focus on staff development and motivation. Google classically have their 20% program. Employees can spend 20% of their time working on personal projects, but obviously targeting the business rather than their own personal incentives. And that project has hatched AdSense, Gmail, Google Maps, so they get a lot of really good feedback and collaboration from sharing that sort of information. And Virgin talk about praising all their people, constantly loving everyone from the cleaner to the executives, and critically listening. And although the data often comes out of the US, the figures are consistent across many countries. So fewer than 3 in 10 employees in the US, in the UK, in Spain, France, and Germany, fewer than 3 in 10 strongly agree that their performance is managed in a way and communicated to them in a way that motivates them to do outstanding work. So finding a way to measure engagement is vital, and it's a really good litmus test for the quality of our communication. And as leaders and managers, we have a tendency to be answer-led. And what that means is we're constantly feeling under pressure to come up with solutions, to find the answers for people. Because of that, we tend to be directive, we tend to be instructive as managers and tell people what to do. And the risk is we damage or jeopardize and don't spend enough time building relationships and engagement. Now, recent events demonstrate what happens when people feel disengaged. So hopefully you've not had to resort to using tear gas on your people yet. But if you have, something's gone very wrong. But reflecting on how people would answer the 5 questions I'm about to share with you would be time really, really well spent. And better still, ask the people. People want to engage. They want to constantly assess how they are engaged, how they feel. They might label it differently by either directly or indirectly, but they will tend to ask themselves these questions. So, do I fit? Nobody wants to be a square peg in a round hole, and people turn down job offers when they're not sure if the company's right for them, or if the potential new manager made them uncomfortable in some way. They may believe they fit at first, but then things change, events happen, and some will seek new jobs. Others will simply switch off, go into survival mode, and become part of the 53%. Am I clear on what's expected of me? Do I have clear objectives? Do I know how my performance is being measured? And are those measures consistent and fair? Do I understand where I fit in the bigger picture? What sort of feedback do I receive on my performance? What opportunities do I get to give feedback to my managers and my leaders? Do I feel supported? And the key word here is feel. Not all actions taken by leaders and claimed as support are actually recognized as support by those on the receiving end. Too many decisions are taken from a frame of self-interest or self-preservation. And people tend to see through this really quickly. So you might achieve some sort of compliance, but they're unlikely to have high levels of engagement. Do I feel valued? How easy is it for me to fit in and contribute? And are those contributions recognized and appreciated? Am I happy to go the extra mile? I'm proud of my work and the team and the company I work for. And when I speak, am I listened to? And then the last question, am I inspired? Do I look forward to going to work or working and having a spring in my step? Am I excited about my projects? Am I simply keen to do my best each day? Am I constantly coming up with ideas to improve products and services and thinking of other ways to add value? So ask yourself how your team would answer these 5 questions. You might be surprised at the answers you get. And if you can, consider taking time to actually ask them. And asking all those questions is great, but then how well do you listen? Really listen. So here are 5 quick top views of listening styles to help you gauge how well you listen to the responses you have when communicating to your team. The first of those is ignoring. I'm sure you don't do this, but in essence, you're not really listening at all. You have no intention of listening to what the other person is saying. At the extreme end of the scale, you might literally be turning your back and not having eye contact. More commonly, you've switched off. You're most likely thinking about how you can interrupt or disagree to get your own point across. Chunk up one, pretending. You're still not really listening to the speaker. However, you are at least trying not to show that you're not listening. Possibly you're trying to avoid hurting their feelings, but you will be deliberately nodding, making the occasional noise to suggest that you're interested in what the other person's saying. And in my more cynical moments, I think businesses have had quite a lot of exposure to listening training, but actually haven't changed their intention. As a result, they've just got a lot better at pretending to listen. Selective. So this is listening only for what you want to hear. People are really good at this, often without realizing that this is what they're doing. We listen for a trigger word or a key phrase that's an opening to stress our own views, and we listen for mistakes or flaws, and we listen for something that supports what we want to hear. And probably more frightening is our ability to pre-program our listening such that we often second guess what we think someone is going to say and then what we believe their intention is, and anything that supports that view leaps out at us from the conversation. Attentive. Finally, we're starting to actually pay attention to what other persons are saying, and we notice the content in much more detail, the words they're using, the way they're saying them, where the emphasis is placed, the speed, the tone, the speech. We may be nodding and grunting to show we're listening, but we will also repeat key messages that we're hearing to check our understanding and demonstrate that we're really paying attention to what's being said. Finally, empathetic listening. The Holy Grail. Your intention is to totally understand what the other person or the team is trying to communicate. You're suspending your own judgment and you simply are seeking information. You'll ask questions to understand and clarify what you're hearing. You will not leap to conclusions about the first thing you hear, but will ask probing questions to establish the speaker's perspective. You'll have reached the point where you recognize that this is about the speaker, not about you. So, probably the last question. Be honest. Which of these levels do you think your team would say you use the most? So be brave, put something into chat now. Okay, I've got empathy, which is great, attentive, high up, selective, empathetic, selective. Okay, great. Well, the good news is we've got nobody who's admitting to being on the first couple of steps, which is very good. But it's a real challenge. I encourage you to really challenge yourself around this. I mean, in a crisis, engagement matters more than ever. And as I've said earlier, I've heard from quite a few businesses who've seen their engagement levels rise in lockdown. And largely, that's been down to the fact that they are communicating more frequently through a wider number of channels, and actually their intention is genuine. Now, Gallup has long researched the impact of remote working on engagement, and that research has probably never been more important to leaders than it is now. So here's a couple of very quick top findings from their research. Interestingly, those who spend 60 to 80% of their time working remotely are actually the most likely to be engaged, and the less time they spend in the office, the more progress they say they make. And also, remote employees are 3 times more likely to be engaged if they receive feedback from their manager at least a few times a month. But if they have conversations with the manager on a weekly basis or more often, they're also 3 times more likely to strongly agree that they're motivated to do outstanding work. So I urge you to consider tracking engagement levels in your organization, your business, your teams, your departments, if you don't already do that, because it's a very effective measure of your team communication effectiveness. And a quick bit of final food for thought. 75% of employers rate teamwork and collaboration as very important. And yet only 18% of employees get evaluated on their communication skill as part of their performance review. So it's a classic say-do mismatch. Right, that wraps up what I was hoping to get through from myself. A couple of things to say. First, of course, there's an offer. So I have online courses. I referred to my question course earlier. You can get, for 3 days, 80% off either the single course or a whole course bundle. If you're interested in live virtual training, then please ask about that. Sorry to be doing the sales pitch, but at the end of the day, it's how we earn a living. So we're keen to give you that opportunity. Also, next week, Thoughts on Thursday session will be Bob leading us on resolving conflict. So keep an eye out for that. But other than that, let's see if we have any questions. First, Bob, can I ask you to randomly pick from the list of attendees a person who's here that can win a free course, and then we'll let them know.
I prepared. I heard you say it earlier on. So Jenna Speed is this week's winner.
Excellent. So Jenna, I will either later today or possibly tomorrow morning, will send you an email with a link to give you free access to that online course. So thank you very much. So I'm very interested in questions. I guess I can stop sharing the screen and go into a big thing. Forgive me if I leave my glasses on now so I can see what I'm doing. What questions do we have, Bob?
Okay, so please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. That would help me greatly if you could. The first question is, I'm holding daily huddles and weekly all hands meetings. Am I communicating too often?
Bottom line, I would say is no. It's almost impossible to communicate too often. Clearly it is. So now I think, and the stats from the end from Gallup suggested how important that can be. People really value that communication. It comes with the caveat, of course, in terms of what the intent of the communication is, and is it authentic and genuine and all in line. So the frequency is good. The frequency is important, but it's good. So I think weekly and a huddle, great. And then just make sure the quality is good as well. Because if, I'm sure you're not, whoever's asked the question, but if you're getting together regularly, but what you're really doing is just, preaching a one-way message to your people, then you are moving people into the neutral 53% category at best, rather than any higher. But yeah, weekly is good.
Cool. Okay, thank you. So my staff are, by survey, saying they're satisfied and with working for my company. So I think they're engaged, but I'm not so sure they're doing all the things that I'm asking them to do.
Okay. So I would say, first, if they're saying, it depends on how you're getting that information. If they're saying satisfied, the risk is that puts them in the 53%. So that may mean they're not unhappy, but it may mean they're neutral. So then it comes down to, if you were saying, sorry, did you say they're not doing what we're asking them to do? Was that
Yes.
So it depends. Basically, it needs communication to find out from them why that is. Because there could be so many different reasons. As I said earlier, it's quite complicated, I guess, communication as a general principle. So assuming you're asking them to do things that are in line with all the stated values, goals, mission, all of those things. So assuming it's all in line, then I would be asking them questions to get feedback from them as to what's stopping them. Because for whatever reason, they're not getting the message. So we're simply not getting our message across to them in a way that's making an impact, but we need feedback to understand that. The worst case scenario is that actually the message is more of a tell, and as a result, you're not giving them the opportunity to get involved, which would keep them more likely in that sort of 53 and more static, not engaged, just surviving type mode. So you have to challenge yourself as to whether, if you're confident in the quality and content of the communication, then it needs feedback and dialogue to understand from their perspective, not your perspective, their perspective, what's going on, so that you can make a change to your strategy and communicate in a way that works for them. But if your assessment is actually, I'm probably telling rather than involving, then you need to reconfigure how you're communicating with them in some way.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How often do you think we should have individual one-to-ones?
It depends what you mean by an individual one-to-one. So, there's because there's formal and informal. So a formal one-to-one, if it's almost in the case of a review, then whether you're doing that monthly, whether you're doing that quarterly, but it really should then be just pulling together all the informal one-to-one conversations you've had around feedback and things, which I would encourage far more frequently. So in a perfect world, you would be talking to everybody in some capacity at least once a week. And the more you can do that, almost the better. But they're informal. You can give feedback to people in the old world at a coffee machine, but you can give feedback to people at any time. It doesn't have to be a sit-down formal one-to-one. So you can constantly have the flow of communication, and then the formal one-to-one can be the sort of way that you pull all that together and summarize and check on progress.
Okay. Another question. Any tips for encouraging feedback?
Yeah, ask for it, because we don't. But only ask for it if you're A, prepared to listen to it, and B, prepared to respond to it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, and it doesn't mean that you have to do whatever somebody's just fed back to you. But all too often, it's that classic mismatch, in fact, because all too often we talk about wanting feedback, but our behavior, the way we handle it, sends a very different message. So somebody tries to tell us something and we brush them away because we're busy, which might be true in that moment, but you've then got to either follow up as quickly as you can and then give them the opportunity or schedule time or whatever. So one of the dangers is that we have a mismatch, or somebody has fed back something and then they've suddenly found they've been attacked, or they've come under a lot of pressure, and that discourages other people. So simply ask for it, be responsible for it, accept other people's position. You don't have to agree or disagree at that point, but ask. Just ask.
Okay, we had one idea from Sasha, which was you could always, of course, pop something at the bottom of your email signature, like a link to a feedback tool or your manager's name, and encourage people to feedback that way. That would be a constant reminder. So thank you for that, Sasha. We have another question. How do I send positive messages? I generally send a personal message every 2 weeks via WhatsApp to encourage people who are on furlough. And to others that are working at work, I send a message once a month. And then we have a meeting for all on a Zoom meeting once a fortnight. So I guess the person asking the question is looking for ways in which to send a more effective, positive message, improve the frequency, reduce it, increase it, change it.
Yeah, it's making me think, really. So, because in a way it's simple, and in a way it isn't. So, at the end of the day, a positive message is either positive or not. It depends on whether it's positive from the sender's perspective or the receiver's perspective. The perfect positive message is positive for both sides most of the time. To me, it then just comes down to simplistically choosing an appropriate channel that matches whatever the audience for the message is, a range of channels if you're communicating to the whole business. And it's about the choice of words, almost, in a way. So positioning something positively is, show them the benefit, make clear what the benefits are, whether it's a future benefit or whether it's a benefit you've just achieved and you want to sort of share the information. But normally it's about making sure the channel is right, making sure that the wording is right, and then you need to seek feedback from people to get from them to understand that they've received the message in the way you intend it. Because at the end of the day, if the concern for the question is actually I'm sending all these positive messages and I'm not getting the vibe that people are positive, the bad news is you need to send your message differently rather than they need to get on board with your message, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We had another thought from Sasha. We could also use a recognition tool, and therefore you could, instead of asking for feedback, you could encourage people to use a recognition tool, put a link to a recognition tool in your email. Encourage your colleagues to recognize each other. And I think if I can build on what Sasha said, then that kind of takes a responsibility away from purely one leader to send out positive messages, and starts to impact the culture where you're encouraging each member of staff to give recognition to other members of staff for doing a good thing. And that could create a little bit of a momentum. What do you think about that recognition stimulation, Richard?
I think all of that is good. My caveat is, at the end of the day, just be careful not to process it totally, to create just a process, so that you need, if you think of the task team individual, that's positioning feedback as a task. It's not necessarily focusing on or dealing with the relationship side of things, and it doesn't always feel totally personal. So it's a great way of getting feedback. It's a great way of influencing the culture. It's a great way of demonstrating intent. So it can work very well, but you still need that more personal interaction in some way. Don't just rely on it as a system, as a process.
Another question. If you're on furlough, how often would you expect to hear from your leaders?
Minimum weekly. I mean, quite a few businesses I've spoken to have been doing something almost daily. Sometimes some are going to focus on individuals, so your teams, the people, I hope. And so it may be that some people who are furloughed you perceive as more vulnerable than others. So some people you might want to communicate more regularly with because they need that. Others may need it less often. So I personally would say, just as a guide, a bare minimum once a week. And probably for some people more often than that, every 2 or 3 days. But it doesn't always have to be you and one-to-one, so you can create opportunities for furloughed people to communicate with other furloughed people, which is like that. I refer to like the water cooler thing. So some companies have set up a Zoom meeting or equivalent that their people can join, and they can just chat. It doesn't have to have an agenda even necessarily. It's just a time for them to share what's going on.
We have another question. You asked us to be more versatile. How do I work out the other person's communication preferences without getting them to fill in a questionnaire?
How long have you got? This is a new webinar, but and Walter will be leaping up and down as well at the moment. Fundamentally, they will give you a lot of clues. People give you clues in the words that they use. People give you clues in their body language. People give you clues in the speed that they talk at and things like that. So once you understand some of the core drivers, and they're just behavioral things, you can get a sense. You have to be careful because it doesn't mean you're necessarily right, but you can get a sense quite quickly of people's preferences. If they're coming at you and they're just firing facts or they're just seeking facts, then that's a clue to how they are processing information. If they're talking all about a concept and a strategy and they're not talking about detail and facts, that's something else. So people will give you quite a lot of clues in channels they use, in how they use things, in their behavior. And it's a bit like listening, the more you're paying attention, because fundamentally it's a listening thing, the more you're paying attention, the more detail you will notice, and the more will leap out at you quickly.
What about things like visual, auditory, kinesthetic? Is it worth picking up on the words people use as to kind of what their modality or what their orientation is?
Yeah, that's NLP. Unfortunately, in 40 minutes, I didn't have time to go into all of that because I would love to. But absolutely. So there's, that's another piece of pretty core software. So whether people process naturally mostly visual information, or whether they're more emotional feelings type stuff, or whether they're more auditory and sound. Again, words give a lot away. Body language gives a lot away. Just how their eye contact even gives a lot away. So once you know the sort of things to look for, then people will give you a lot of clues. But left to our own devices, that's the versatility challenge. Most of us will tend to communicate in our code because it works for us, but we assume it works for other people, and it doesn't. And of course, in the team environment, you'll have a range of codes within a team. So you have to make sure you have elements of your communication that touches all of those bases, if at all possible.
Fascinating. Well, we're into our final minute, Richard. What would you like to say to wrap up and conclude?
No, well, thank you very much for taking the time to attend the webinar. It's a fascinating subject that's ridiculously deep and complicated, so I hope I've managed to do some justice to it. Obviously, if you're interested in knowing more about all of the sort of software and stuff, then do ask for a chat. We're offering these 30-minute chats, very happy to do that. And the more we can encourage people to be sophisticated in their communication, the better. And actually, often it's very small changes to move between different things. It's not a major change, it's a subtle change, but it has a huge impact.
Richard, it's been a pleasure. I hope everyone's enjoyed themselves. We've had lots of feedback on the chat, which is very positive. So thank you for your time, everybody. We wish you well. Please stay safe and stay well, and we'll see you again, hopefully, next week. Bye now.
Take care. Bye, everyone.